Now the men and their wives raised a great outcry against their fellow Jews. Some were saying, "We and our sons and daughters are numerous. In order for us to eat and stay alive, we must get grain." Others were saying, "We are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our homes to get grain during the famine." Still others were saying, "We've had to borrow money to pay the king's tax on our fields and vineyards. Although we are the same flesh and blood as our fellow Jews, and though our children are as good as theirs, yet we have to subject our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we are powerless because our fields and our vineyards belong to others." When I heard their outcry and these charges, I was very angry. I pondered them in my mind and then accused the nobles and officials. I told them, "You are charging your own people interest." So I called together a large meeting to deal with them and said, "As far as possible, we have bought back our fellow Jews who were sold to the Gentiles. Now you are selling your own people, only for them to be sold back to us." They kept quiet because they could find nothing to say. So I continued, "What you are doing is not right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of our God to avoid the reproach of our Gentile enemies? I and my brothers and my men are also lending the people money and grain. But let us stop charging interest. Give back to them immediately their fields, vineyards, olive groves, and houses, and also the interest you are charging them, 1% of the money, grain, new wine, and olive oil. We will give it back," they said, "and we will not demand anything more from them. We will do as you say." This is God's word. A picture paints 1,000 words, or so they say. A video or an animation, by extrapolation, must paint tens of thousands of words. And our series in Nehemiah is accompanied by a children's animation each Sunday, and we've been showing those films in Biggar as part of our children's talk. There's a scene in this Sunday's animation where the Gentile neighbors of the inhabitants of Jerusalem are looking at them from a distance over a sand dune with a spy glass as they're building the wall. And that's a graphic picture of the immediate context of this passage that we're looking at this morning. Other people watching the people of God. Isn't that a picture of us as God's people? We are called to shine our light before people. Those are the instructions that Isaiah gave us in chapter 60 of his book that we looked at a couple of weeks ago. Arise, shine. And it's what Jesus tells us to do. Let your light shine before others. Our calling is to reflect God's character as individuals by the way we live, but also as a community by the way that we live together. The problem was, and let's be frank, often is, that the people of God weren't being very shiny as others looked on them. Specifically, the situation was this. As the people were building the wall, as they were all mucking in together, there were some who had wealth and there were some who had next to nothing. Amongst the people of God, there were rich people and there were poor people. Well, that's only natural. There is indeed nothing wrong with that. We have people in our fellowship from all backgrounds, and all are welcome. But it came about, we're not sure the exact circumstances, that scarcity, even famine, arose in the land. And the rich, of course, had a cushion against the blow, but the poor were put up against the wall by this turn of events. The poor did what people do in such circumstances. They went to their rich neighbors to borrow from them. And some even went to their Gentile neighbors for loans. They were borrowing, not to buy a car or to build a house, but so they could have food to eat and survive in the famine. And on top of all this, there were taxes to be paid to the Persian emperor, a poll tax, not a percentage of income. So everyone had to pay the same tax, whether they were rich or poor. The poor were given loans to make ends meet. They weren't being refused help. And you could say that the rich amongst God's people were being generous, but they were being generous only to a point. The problem, however, was the conditions on which these loans were given. Although it sounds like it when you read the passage, it wasn't that the poor were being required to pay high interest rates for the loans. Charging interest, in fact, was against God's law. The rich Jews knew that. They made sure that they weren't breaking the letter of God's law. They weren't allowed, according to the written law, to charge interest. But they were allowed to exact a guarantee or a pledge for their loans. Today we would say that the poor were being required to put up collateral for what they borrowed. Remember, this was a matter of survival for many. It was about borrowing to have enough food to survive. What the poor were required to put up in pledges or guarantees were in order of severity. One, the crop that they would harvest in future years. Two, the title deeds to their lands. And three, even their children. They were given the loans in return for these guarantees, and if they failed to pay back the loan, they would lose their crop for next year, they would lose their land, they could even lose their children, who would become slaves to the lender of the loan. Because circumstances were so severe, many of the poor were losing their crops, their land, and even their children. Nehemiah sees all this. In verse 6 he writes, "When I heard their outcry," the outcry of those suffering and these charges against those making loans, I was very angry. It's interesting, however, in the next verse, in verse 7, Nehemiah says that although he was angry, I pondered these things. The word pondered here comes from a root word which means to rule. And the New English Bible translates this sentence as, I mastered my feelings. As we've seen before, anger is not always wrong. God is angry by injustice in the world. But God's anger and our anger, when it's a reflection of God's justice, is a settled opposition to what is not right. Nehemiah's anger here, I believe, was a reflection of what God was feeling towards this whole situation. Nehemiah, as he ponders, realizes the root of the problem. And as a result, he accuses the nobles and the officials, those who were wealthy and powerful amongst God's people. And he lays out the situation, and I imagine he lays it out in a non-emotive way, but he puts blame on those who were truly to blame. And the upshot is these wealthy, powerful folks agree to change their ways. That is highly unusual, you will know. Powerful and wealthy people very rarely change their minds. An important factor, however, not to be overlooked, is how Nehemiah himself behaves given the situation. In the rest of the chapter, Nehemiah explains to us, the readers, not just his words of accusation against the perpetrators of injustice, but how he, Nehemiah, acted. Although he was the governor appointed by the emperor of Persia, although he, Nehemiah, was the highest official in the land, and although he could have been the richest man around, Nehemiah forgoes the salary and the taxes that he could have exacted from the people, rich and poor. Nehemiah and his family buy back children who were sold into slavery. Nehemiah loans people money without asking for extortionate guarantees. And Nehemiah has an open table, all at his own expense, where he feeds 150 people free of charge every day. In short, Nehemiah puts his money where his mouth is. Nehemiah isn't a hypocrite railing against injustice while doing nothing about it himself. And I think it's probably Nehemiah's example that was a big factor in getting the nobles and the officials to change their ways. Nehemiah himself lived out a different way that they could see and emulate. So what does all this mean to us? 3,000 years and 3,000 miles removed from Nehemiah and the people of God in Jerusalem. Well, I think the most important phrase in all of the passage that we've been looking at is found there in verse 9. Nehemiah calls the people to walk in the fear of God. What does that mean? Well, firstly, what doesn't it mean? Walking in the fear of God doesn't mean just woodenly following the written law. The nobles and the officials in the situation described in chapter 5 weren't breaking God's law, but they weren't walking in the fear of God. They weren't walking in the reverence of God. They weren't walking with reference to God. They weren't acknowledging God's character of abundant generosity and abundant compassion. They were following God's law, but they weren't following God's heart. And our calling as God's people is to do just that, to follow God's heart, to walk and to live and to act with reference to Him, to listen as He speaks, Through his word, yes. Through his laws, yes. But also as his Spirit stirs us with compassion for other people. Our calling as God's people is to live with reference to just how generous God has been with us. As Christian people, even more than the ancient people of God, we have seen just how generous God is. And that we have seen that God gave his only Son for us. And because God is that generous, that although we can never hope to repay what God has done for us, we should in turn be extravagant in our giving and in our compassion when others are in need. That is how, in this passage, Nehemiah lived, walking in the fear of God. And it's how we should live too. And when we do that, when we walk like that, those people looking at us through those spy glasses will see not just us, and not just our actions, but they will see God and God's character reflected by us. That God, by his Spirit, will draw their hearts to him.